So it's my task to introduce the fivefold giftings that we find in Ephesians chapter 4. We're going to do that by primarily diving deep into the passage and then moving on to some of the more potential practical outworkings of this. Apologies if occasionally this is slightly chunky or even clunky. I want to share a PowerPoint with you at some stages, and I want to make sure I stick to the script as well. Trying to multitask at my age is a bit of a challenge, but we'll do our best. I think if we're honest, many of us in church leadership have become a bit wary of the latest thing in church life. Sometimes those things come, don't they, with exaggerated promises of all the difference they'll make. There is no silver bullet. There is no one thing that if we do this, it'll turn everything around. The context in which we live and work, it's far too complex for that to be true. But potentially there are a number of key areas that we should be giving attention to. And for me, Alan Hirsch really helpfully identifies those four broad areas that we need to be thinking about in terms of Jesus and discipleship, about our understanding and practice of mission and the way we're organized. I think we would suggest to you that actually addressing the issue of the fivefold ministries does in one way or another help us move forward in all of those areas. It could be foundational in helping us find our way forward as we emerge into a very different post-COVID world. And the conclusion that we read together from that we'll read together in a moment, even from Ephesians, the conclusion of the passage is quite startling. The Apostle Paul writes, Jesus makes the whole body fit together perfectly. As each part does its own special work, it helps the other parts grow, so the whole body is healthy and growing and full of love. I know, I promised it wasn't a silver bullet, but that's his conclusion. That's why it seems so significant. And surprise, surprise, the person in recent years who's consistently written, thought, taught, worked and lived this out is Alan Hirsch. Neil Cole is another practitioner and writer. And personally, I've read most of this stuff. When a number of years ago we were in Densham, leading Densham Baptist Church, we worked with it there. If you remember that wonderful pre-COVID world that we enjoyed, about this time last year, we just managed to squeeze in 3 Saturday mornings where we did some training together. And I'm also just coming towards the end now of a year's training with 5Q to equip me more thoroughly to coach in this area. So let's look at that passage that we find in Ephesians chapter 4. I'm going to bring up those verses. If I can make this work, here we go. Ephesians chapter 4. Therefore, I, a prisoner for serving the Lord, beg you to lead a life worthy of your calling, for you've been called by God. Always be humble and gentle. Be patient with each other, making allowance for one another's faults because of your love. Make every effort to keep yourselves united in the Spirit, binding yourselves together with peace. For there is one body and one Spirit, just as you have been called to one glorious hope for the future. There's one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all, in all, and living through all. However, he has given to each one of us a special gift through the generosity of Christ. That's why the scriptures say, when he ascended to the heights, he led a crowd of captives and gave gifts to his people. Notice that it says he ascended. This clearly means that Christ also descended to our lowly world. And the same one who descended is the one who ascended higher than all the heavens, so that he might fill the entire universe with himself. Now, these are the gifts Christ gave to the church: the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, and the pastors and teachers. Their responsibility is to equip God's people to do his work and build the church, the body of Christ. This will continue until we all come to such unity in our faith and knowledge of God's Son that we will be mature in the Lord, measuring up to the full and complete standard of Christ. Then we will no longer be like children, We won't be blown and tossed about by every wind of new teaching. We will not be influenced when people try to trick us with lies so clever they sound like the truth. Instead, we will speak the truth in love, growing in every way more and more like Christ, who is the head of the body, the church. He makes the whole body fit perfectly together. As each part does its own special work, it helps the other parts grow so that the whole body is healthy and growing and full of love. First of all, let's consider the context within which Ephesians was written. Just as the 100 Years' War didn't last 100 years, just as Panama hats apparently come from Ecuador, this isn't really the letter to the Ephesians, is it? It's actually a circular letter, probably written to all the churches in Asia Minor, and as part of those churches, the church at Ephesus would have received it. So it appears to be a circular letter, and it's written by Paul at his most articulate and fulsome in his description and understanding of the nature of the church. And in the midst of this, we get chapter 4. So if we look at this overall context, yes, it's a circular letter. We need to also think about the sociological context. This letter is written to the whole church in each place, not just the leadership. When this was being read out, everyone was in the room, men and women, slave and free, rich and poor, Jew and Gentile, young and old. And there was a communal and participatory mindset, as opposed to our individualistic and consumerist culture that we're part of. So the significance of the letter, well, it's Paul's ecclesiology at its most complete, and it's circulated to a group of churches, and everyone is included. And when you look in detail at the passage, these 16 verses, there is a logical progression to it. Paul starts, doesn't he, with this emphasis on unity. We're familiar with the great, almost creedal statements in verses 4 and 5. Paul is describing the foundational unity of the church and our role in maintaining that. And so we have this context of committed relationships, a common purpose, and you get this stacking up, don't you? One, and then suddenly in verse 7, his tone changes. And you go from 1 to, however, to each one of you is given. And Paul shifts from unity to diversity, specifically the diversity of the fivefold giftings or graces of Apis, apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, and teacher. But this diversity is embedded and it's grounded in the unity that he's already described. Before we look in detail at the fivefold, it's worth continuing in this logical progression, because Paul goes on, his conclusion seems to be that if you put these two things together, if you have the fivefold operating out of unity, then what you get is maturity and fullness. It leads to the maturity and the fullness of Christ being lived out in the church. And so in verse 13, he writes, this will continue until we all come to such unity in our faith and knowledge of God's Son, that we will be mature in the Lord, measuring up to the full and complete standard of Christ, growing in every way more and more like Christ, who is the head of his body, the church. And again, verse 16, which I read earlier, he makes the whole body fit perfectly together. As each part does its own special work, it helps the other parts grow, so the whole body is healthy and growing and full of love. So that's the overall structure and makeup of the passage. But as we move on from that, sorry, I just need to find it. Here we go. Just finding my place in the notes. Let's dig a little deeper into that diversity piece, shall we? The fivefold. In verses 7 to 11, Paul writes about the 5 ascension gifts that Jesus has given to the church. And the tense that he uses is significant. He chooses to use the aorist indicative. And all that means is something that took place in the past and is a once and for all event. And the fivefold have been given as a gift to the church. We don't have to import them into the church. They are already present. they have been given. And this one verb is attached to all 5. They come as a unit. We need to bear in mind too that Paul starts a line of thought in verse 7, and then he goes off on a digression, and then he returns to his original line of thinking in verse 11. And if you miss the digression out, I mean, the digression's important, but we're not going to focus on it this morning. If you follow that chain of thought through, well, let me show you how that works. Again, if I can share screen, here we go. 2 different versions of verses 7 and then verse 11 of Ephesians. However, he has given each one of us a special gift through the generosity of Christ. Now, these are the gifts Christ gave to the church: the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and the teachers. Another translation puts it like this: but to each one of us, grace has been given as Christ apportioned it. It was he who gave some to be apostles, some to be prophets, some to be evangelists, some to be pastors and teachers. So we need to think about, what would that mean to the original hearers? Remember, the whole church is gathered, rich and poor, men and women, Jew and Gentile. They're all there in the room. What Paul is saying is, this applies to every believer. In the room, there are present expressions of the apostolic, the prophetic, the evangelistic, the shepherding, and the teacher. That's what Paul says. Follow the argument through. Just hold that thought. We'll come back to it. It's more nuanced than that. We'll come back to it in a minute. But let's not confuse these 5 with the lists of spiritual gifts that we find elsewhere in the New Testament. Those are gifts of the Holy Spirit. These are ascension gifts from Jesus to the church. These 5 are different to the spiritual gifts in that the spiritual gifts operate within these ways of serving. This gift really almost is a personality. I don't want to push that too far, and I might push that a bit too far in the training that we did earlier in the year. There's some helpful stuff there, but if we're not careful, we tip over into that over-individualistic way. More importantly, these are ways of serving. These are not 5 distinctive personality types, because there's a huge breadth of expression in each of them, and each one of us are unique. But these 5 are present in the church, and they are present in each one of us. And so each one of us primarily will be 1 or 2 of these expressed in our own way, and we'll have bits of the others added in as well. We'll do some very practical stuff about this towards the end. So you may primarily be an evangelist, but because you're an evangelist, you will love people, and so you'll have something of the shepherding in you as well. And in many evangelists, not all, but in many evangelists, there's a prophetic edge as well that helps them break through into people's lives. I mean, look at the Apostle Paul. The clue's in the title, isn't it? But in his letters to Timothy, he also refers to himself as teacher and evangelist, as well as apostle. So when these 5 different ministries learn how to function and how to function together, then the church begins to flourish in the ways described in this passage. That's the really significant bit. What Paul is describing here is a living system. Because we have a cultural lens through which we read scripture, and because our culture tends towards the individualistic and the consumerist, we can focus on, well, what am I? We need to explore that. But much more significant is that these are a living system designed to function together. This is the body of Christ. If I can use a music analogy, and apologies, I'm not a musician, so if this grates with any of you who are, please forgive me in advance. But imagine 5 different notes, okay? And I buy a keyboard. And first of all, I play this one. And it's a lovely, clear, distinctive sound. And then I play this one. And again, the same is true. But with the right 5 notes, when I do this, something else happens, doesn't it? harmony. That's what the Apostle Paul is describing here. When these five come and flow together, you get a glorious harmony. We'll look at that in a little more detail in a moment. But first of all, let's kind of step back and define the five. This bit is going to be really whistle stop, okay? If we're going to journey further together, we do need to spend longer with this. We need to develop a shared vocabulary, because otherwise, if I talk about prophetic, I use the same word as you, but I might mean something entirely different. So we need to understand what a healthy expression of each of these looks like. And when it comes to this, Alan Hirsch, I think, draws a really helpful distinction between calling and function. Calling and function. What is the reason? What is the purpose? What is the function behind this gift that Jesus bestows on the church? So we're going to focus on those. And again, I'm going to share screen. Just roll that one on. There we go. Function of the apostle. Before we kind of identify this, it might be helpful just to identify that for some of us, the term apostle comes with a whole load of baggage. It's a term you're uncomfortable with, and it might be helpful to try and work out why. Some of us have had bad experience in the past of people who call themselves apostle, but actually it was a controlling, hierarchical, authoritative figure. It wasn't very helpful. That's why we need agreed, healthy understandings. By the way, there is no hierarchy in the fivefold. I know the Apostle Paul writes about first the apostles, secondly the prophets, but surely he's writing to a missional movement. And what he's describing is first people on the ground are the apostles, second the prophets, and the rest pile in afterwards. Let's be honest, most of us have heard really unhelpful and poor teaching on a Sunday morning. We're also aware of manipulative preachers who have used their platform for the wrong reasons. But I don't think we've given up on teaching or preaching, have we? We've addressed the problem. Same with the apostolic. And the apostolic function is in the name. Apostle literally is a sent one. And the function of the apostle is to maintain the sentness of the church. We are God's sent people. We are not supposed to be a settled institution. We are a missional movement. And apostles help the church keep moving forward. And the obvious biblical example is Paul. At the end of Romans, it seems to me that he almost defines what it means for him to be an apostle. It's not an overarching description, but for Paul, he said, it's always been my ambition to preach the gospel where Christ was not known, so that I would not be building on someone else's foundations. Paul's apostolic ministry is about this extending and deepening. Peter's apostolic ministry was quite different. Some of us have people in our denomination or in our stream who within the structures are described as having an apostolic ministry and an overseeing ministry. And we need wise people like that. But the function of the apostolic is to maintain the sentness of the church. What did Jesus say? As the Father has sent me, so I am sending you. And then the prophetic. The purpose of the prophet is to maintain the covenant faithfulness of the people of God. That's the function. That's why the prophetic folk are often calling us to worship and to prayer. There is a longing after God, a desire for holiness and for God's people to embrace their calling, to be set apart for him. But the prophetic function is not only vertical, is it? Not only vertical, it's also horizontal. And the prophet often will cry out for social justice. The prophet is about faithfulness and about the forgotten. The prophet draws our attention to our values, to our culture, to our integrity. And so if the apostle calls attention to the Great Commission, so if the apostle calls us to the Great Commission, the prophet calls us to the greatest commandment, to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and our neighbour as ourselves. And then the evangelist. What's the function of the evangelist? Well, very unspiritually, the purpose of the evangelist is to maintain recruitment. Okay. The evangelist is passionate about sharing the good news, but the evangelist is also passionate that all of us do that as well. If you know one, you'll know that. And then the shepherd. The function of the shepherd is to maintain healthy community. Why shepherd and not pastor? Because in many of the translations, the fivefold comes out as pastor. Well, there are two reasons. First of all, there's a flippant reason. Well, it helps with alliteration, doesn't it? Apest sounds better than apept, and it saves some confusion. But there is a more significant reason. You see, it is the only place in the Bible where the term pastor is used. We made a lot of it, haven't we, in the church for one word. But behind that word, the root of the word is shepherd, which helps us tap into the biblical root of the word that's used here. I mentioned earlier the training that I'm doing with 5Q at the moment. One of the telling statements that's been used, or at least it struck me, was this, that we've neutered the shepherds in the church. We've neutered the shepherds in the church. And what they're suggesting is that the function of the shepherd in the Bible is much broader and more significant than many of our pastoral care models tend to embrace. The function of the shepherd ultimately is to foster the creation of healthy communities. And there are many skills and attributes that lie behind the ability to do that. But the function, if you like, is to develop this kind of organizational, emotional intelligence that leads to healthy communities. And then finally, the teacher. The function of the teacher actually is not to teach. It will involve teaching, but the function is to foster learning. We do a load of teaching in the church, don't we? And I've done loads in my time, but I wonder how much learning takes place. There's a load more we could say about the fivefold, but that needs to wait to another time. And if you think about it, when we first faced lockdown, when we first went into lockdown, these five were clearly revealed amongst us. I mean, the apostolic emerged, didn't they? Because they were looking about, as soon as we went into lockdown, they were like, wow, what are the possibilities? What new things can we do? How can we do this online? They embraced all of that. Did you hear the prophetic voice? There were others who were saying, oh, this is an amazing time to withdraw into the presence of God, to seek him afresh, to know him. Did you notice the evangelists? They arose with an urgency and wanting to seize the opportunity. The shepherds felt the pain. Often individually they felt pain because they couldn't be with people in the way they wanted to be. But also they felt the pain of others. And the teachers were really easy to spot as well, because the teachers knew what the regulations were. However often the government changed them, the teachers knew what they were. Just kind of game with the territory, really, doesn't it? So we see the diversity of these five. But when they're grounded in unity, then Paul describes what grows in verses 12 through to 16. And in verse 13, he says this. He says that we might reach the fullness of Christ. Notice the direct relationship between apest and the fullness of Christ expressed in the church. No apest, no fullness. Because in Jesus, you find all five, don't you? Jesus was an apostle. Hebrew describes him as that, as well as he self-describes that as well, doesn't he? Just as the Father has sent me, the apostolic word. Jesus was a prophet. Jesus was an evangelist. He's the good shepherd. He's the best teacher there's ever been. You find these five fully expressed in Jesus. So how can we be the church? How can we be the body of Christ? How can we be the living embodiment of Jesus if we don't have these different characteristics of Jesus active and present in our life as the church? So let's kind of deep dive into the passage. Let's now just draw out. We'll look at how this might function in us as an individual and how this might function in us corporately. But again, in both of these areas, we're trying to think living system, not strengths. And so as an individual, there's a whole variety of APES tests that you could do. And I think the best way to do it, the recommended way to do it, is not to do the test straight away. The way to do it is to just be clear about the definitions. What is the apostolic? What is the prophetic? So you've got those clear in your mind. And then think through, well, what might I be? What about these 5? Where do I get excited? Where do I live this out? And then when you've got some kind of idea, then you talk with the people who know you closest. Obviously, they need to know the same definitions of the 5 as well. And then take the test as a bit of a comparison. And if you do the 5Q test, I'm going to share screen again, then what they encourage you to do is they encourage you to think about your APES footprint. Now, if your real footprint is this shape, you're in trouble, aren't you? But it's just a way of putting and visualizing your score. So I'm going to stick on here. These are the way I scored. Okay, so the biggest one, teaching, followed by apostolic, then shepherding, evangelistic, prophetic. Okay, this is a comparative test. It's not about competence. So if I'd scored 95 in teaching, it doesn't mean that I'm a better teacher than the fact that I scored 37. This is about the comparison between these. If we're going to re-Jesus the church, we need all 5 in the church, already said that. If we're going to develop our discipleship, then there is a discipleship aspect to this, because the ultimate aim of discipleship is that I should grow to be more and more like Jesus. Jesus was all 5 of these. So I need to give attention to all 5 if I'm going to grow more and more like Jesus. Their observations, 5Q and others' observations over these kind of scores over the decades go something like this. So my top one there is teaching, teacher. And this is the kind of paradigm or the lens through which I see the world. They're the kind of ideas that I'm drawn to and that motivate me. So, for example, as a local church leader, when I went into the office or sat down behind my desk or whatever I did, first thing on Monday morning, guess what I did? I thought, who's preaching on Sunday? Is it me? And if it was me, that's what I got on with, because that was what motivated me. If you're a shepherd and a church leader, then I suspect the first thing that you do on a Monday morning is think, who do I need to visit? Who do I need to follow up on? And then this secondary capacity, for me, apostolic, this secondary capacity is usually the voice through which you speak to others. This is how people hear you. And it's usually the language that you receive best. And because of this, often we get the top 2 muddled up. And I know quite a lot of people who have done the test and found that these 2 are reversed. Okay? Because this is the way other people hear you. And these top 2, for me, teaching and apostolic, these top 2 function in a particular way. They combine together, which is why 5Q call it your APES couplet. And they do also create a lens through which you see the world, which is one of the reasons, it's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons why sometimes you get tension in leadership teams. Because if you've got somebody who is teaching apostolic, engaging with somebody who is strongly shepherding, then actually the way you view things can be quite different. The other way of thinking about it is quite simply about left hand, right hand. Okay, I am right-handed. So instinctively, using my right hand is quite easy. And most of the time, I don't even think about it. And so instinctively, these are the 2 things that I lean into, the teaching and the apostolic. If I want to use particularly the weak 2, the evangelistic and the prophetic, then it's like using my left hand. I have to work much harder on it. I have to concentrate harder. And actually, I prefer not to do it. I'd rather use my right hand all the time. This third one here, shepherding, is usually a skill, but it's not a passion. You're not fired by it. And again, so to illustrate that, I remember we had, again, when I was at Densham, we had a student minister who was going to come and spend the summer with us. In the end, he didn't come because there were issues in his own church that he had to go and kind of deal with. But I met him for an initial conversation about, was this going to work? And I was really surprised by what he asked me, actually, because I would never have asked this question if I was going on placement. If he asked me once, he asked me 2 or 3 times, will I be able to go and visit people? Would you give me a list of people I could go and visit? I will be able to visit. And I thought it was very strange because he was a shepherd. I'd have been asking a question about, well, what's your strategy about this? And would I be preaching, and what would I be preaching on? So I could be beginning to think about it. It's just the way that we see things. These bottom 2, for me, evangelistic and prophetic, these need discipline and accountability for me to grow in them. And I do need to grow in these 2 areas. Because see, the thing is, these 2 weakest areas can hold back my strengths. And so, for example, if you're strongly apostolic and weakly shepherding, then your weak shepherding will hold back your fruitfulness in the apostolic. Because ultimately, even apostolic figures need folk who will follow and go with them. And if your shepherding is really weak, then ultimately people won't go with you. You'll keep burning people out and leaving them behind. Equally, if we flip that on its head, if you're strongly shepherding and weakly apostolic, then what you'll do is you will develop a wonderful community, but ultimately it may not go anywhere. And so we need to address our weaknesses. And one of the ways we do that, of course, is we hang out with somebody. So if we're strongly shepherding and aware we're not very apostolic, we make sure that we hang out with the apostolic person. We share our lives with them. And this stuff is as much caught as taught, isn't it? We're not going to explore this, but APEST isn't limited to church life, is it? It's true in all of life. And you often see that, don't you, in the way people are employed. So if you are in a caring profession and you absolutely love it, then you're almost certainly strong shepherding. Equally, if as part of your job, there is the opportunity to develop new systems and new ways of doing and think differently about things, that's probably your apostolic being fulfilled. Equally, evangelists make great salespeople because it's just who they are. So let's move on then to think about how this works. Oh, finally, one other thing that is really important to say. Character eats competence for breakfast every day. Character eats competence for breakfast every day. So looking at my footprint, I could be at the top of my game, teaching and apostolic wise, but if my character is at fault, if I am not growing in the fruit of the Spirit, then despite my competence, I'm a car crash waiting to happen. So we also need to allow the Holy Spirit to keep working on our character, because that really is the foundation of everything. Let's think about how this might work in community. And again, it's another diagram, I'm afraid. They call this the spidergram. But what you can do on this is you can plot. So you can plot out that way. So shepherding, the further up the arrow you go, the higher you score as a shepherd. So what you can do is you can plot the comparative things. So that's shepherd and teacher and apostolic. And then you end up with a shape like that. And what you can do is you can use this as a way of, as a team, of plotting everybody's outline on this diagram. So there's somebody else. And what you do then is you build up a sense of how you are as individuals within a team. And this can be useful. So really good friend of mine, Andy Glover, leading a church in Chester, as well as other things. At the beginning, they're aware, because they know one another and they've done this kind of stuff together, they are aware that they are a strongly apostolic team. And so guess what? Beginning of the first lockdown, yes, let's go for it. And they did a whole load of great stuff. And then in the summer, Andy was aware of the weariness, that people were getting weary. And he was aware that actually if he wasn't careful and the apostolic voices kept leading the way, they would just burn people out. And so at some stage, they said as a team, they said to the shepherding people on their leadership team, you need to lead the discussion. You need to take responsibility for this, because we need to hear your voice first, because that's where we are as a church at the moment. So you know, when we know where one another are, when we're able to lean into one another, it just helps in that. And another way you can use this particular diagram is that there is another survey, of course, that you pay for. There's another survey where actually, instead of surveying individuals and plotting those on, there's a survey where you survey the organization, or you survey the church or whatever it is. And then this isn't quite so easy to see. It's a bit fainter, but you get the idea. It's the same kind of five-sided shape as a pentagon, isn't it? Where you plot the individuals on, where everybody takes part in this survey, and then what you do is you get the shape of the organization of the church. Is just another way of doing that, of thinking about that. But again, another thing we need to remember is that culture eats strategy for breakfast every day. And so I just, as I kind of conclude, and then 2 sentences of summary, I wonder what a healthy APES culture would look like. You know, if this is going to flourish amongst us and in our churches, what would it look like? Not all of these things I've listed actually are culture. Some of them are kind of almost summary points, but never mind. I mean, one of the things you would need if it was going to be healthy would be this shared and agreed understanding and vocabulary. Otherwise, as I've said, we're using the same words, but meaning entirely different things. Ideally, you would have all 5 in the room, healthy expressions. It's not always possible. And there are ways you can overcome that, aren't there? I mean, if you're aware, do you know what, we're missing the evangelist, then one of the ways you could do it is you could bring an evangelist into the room from time to time and get them to lead, or get them to talk about how they would address this issue or this opportunity or whatever. The other way you can do it is, if you've worked out, well, how would an evangelist think, then you can choose to say, do you know what, for the next 10 minutes as we talk about this issue, we're all going to pretend we're evangelists, and we're going to try and think that way through this situation. This next bit, this is much more the kind of cultural thing, isn't it? There would be respect, honouring and valuing of the insight and input of one another. I mean, you would hope you'd have that in any leadership team, but with this particular lens, it helps you more and more. I mean, I remember it turned out in our leadership team in Densham on the eldership, there were strong apostolic voices and there were strong prophetic voices. And occasionally in the room, or more than occasionally in the room, there was tension, because apostles and prophets think very differently. You know, with apostles, make a plan. With prophets, we need to pray about it. And when we'd done this, we just understood one another better, and we recognized the need to hear, not always to do what the apostles were saying or that the prophets were saying, but to hear and respect one another. Diversity and divergent opinions welcomed and expected. When you've got 5, we need all 5 voices. And again, comfortable with conflicting ideas before we reach resolution. And sometimes that takes time, doesn't it? Shared vision, purpose, direction of travel. Otherwise, we're just a load of hot air, isn't it? Inevitably, you would have a learning environment. And then that kind of sense of dynamism, synergy, and harmony. Right, 2 sentences just to kind of sum this up then. That was a whistle-stop tour. It's not a magic bullet, but if we're going to transform out of a settled institution to a Jesus-centered missional movement, maybe we need to recognize that we need all of these 5 working together in this living system, and we need to take the necessary steps to see that happen. Because remember, the Apostle Paul states that these 5 are already present in the people of God.